change of format again for the second episode. Partly because I have tried to record this 3 times now, and the whole kind of record it as I am tinkering, I don't know about it as a format, should we say. I thought for Steam Deck Roulette this time round we would take a different approach, and I'd gotten thinking about Tomb Raider, partly because we'd started playing some DOS games, and I thought that was an interesting thing to kind of have a look at. The other reason was that Tomb Raider, there are so many different versions, so many different ways to go about it. I was kind of just curious what would be a good way to play Tomb Raider in 2023 on a handheld PC. So we're going to start off with the most obvious place to start, I guess, which is the official Steam release of Tomb Raider 1, as it's now called on Steam because they made a remake with the same name. So this will be, the original 1996 PC game. It has got 3DFX logos baked into it, and it's a pretty flawed release, even on Windows. So runs in DOSBox, as most of those Steam games do. Configuration's probably fairly out of date these days. Most of the PC recommendations seem to say buy it, download the files, and then rip the files out and put them in some other way of playing this. Even if that is kind of configuring your own DOSBox X, or if you're on a PC like PCEM or 86box, something like that. But staying true to the actual Steam Deck experience, I wanted to see what the experience would be if you just had the game, installed it, played it without touching anything. And the experience is middling at best, I would say. As you could probably tell, the cutscenes are interlaced and ugly as sin. And some of them don't even display properly. You get audio without any video. The graphics are washed out. They're clean and they're sharp, but they are definitely, the contrast does not look very good. And it kind of suffers from being a DOSBox game. There's some great kind of controller configurations that people have put together, and they replicate essentially the PlayStation 1 controller layout, even with the digital controls kind of mapped to the analog stick. So if you want to play it with an analog stick, you can do that, and that stuff works out of the box. But it is bare bones is probably the best way to say it, and it's probably fair to say that it's a pretty unloved port or version of the original DOS game. The audio is broken as well, so some of the music doesn't play properly. Not a particularly beautiful way to play Tomb Raider. It works. It's functional. Although, if you look at ProtonDB, there's plenty of people saying that it's quite crashy. And certainly because we're talking about the original Tomb Raider here, but some of this is kind of fair to say of the first 5 games. They all run on the same engine. But certainly looking at the Tomb Raider 2 kind of ProtonDB, there's a lot more mentions of kind of stability issues. Now, we will get into trying to tweak the PC version of Tomb Raider in a little bit, but I'm going to save that until later in the video. I kind of just wanted to show off some of the game and kind of the experience out of the box. So, same as before, we're running 1280 by 800. We are running through the official Steam Deck dock. Not that makes much difference, but just to say that. I'm playing with a PlayStation 4 controller plugged in via USB. And I have got a keyboard and mouse to hand plugged in as well. So when we start getting into some desktop stuff, I'm using a keyboard and mouse because, to be honest, if you're going to type in commands, you want a physical keyboard. You don't want to be doing that with the... I've tried to do that. I've tried to type in terminal commands with the on-screen keyboard. It's not an experience that I recommend. So that is kind of the PC version. It is functional at best. And I don't think, I mean, this is currently going for $4.99, I think, on Steam. You can pick it up on Good Old Games as a pack of the first 3 games. I would assume they're in a better state than the Steam versions are. But I think that would probably be my gut feel in terms of if you want to play the PC versions. I'd go with the Good Old Games releases. But, you know, a lot of people probably ended up with this game because of some sort of IDOS bundle that you bought many years ago. I know I certainly picked these up when they were kind of, I don't know, 60, 70p. So pretty cheap. At that point, I think it's probably a bit easier to swallow. The next step for me is looking at other alternatives. So obviously with the Steam Deck, you've got EmuDeck, which can emulate a wide range, an increasingly wide range of systems. The obvious place to start is PlayStation. So there's a really mature, good quality PlayStation emulator on the Steam Deck. As you would imagine, Tomb Raider runs like an absolute dream. Uses very little power. The cutscenes render properly. You can do all of the things that you kind of expect that you can do on a PlayStation emulator. You can run it at higher resolutions. You can use PGXP to correct the geometry wobble. You can run it at lower resolutions. So if you want to run it as if it was a real PlayStation, you can absolutely do that. If you want to run it at 16:9 and run it widescreen and open up the render, that's something that seems like a lot of these emulators are starting to do, and I think it's interesting. I'm not sure it really depends on the game. If you try it with something like Crash Bandicoot, it's really odd because they're obviously only drawing in the geometry they need, so you just see black around the edges of the screen as it's, you know, loading trees out of memory by the clever things that it was doing at the time. Tomb Raider's a little bit similar. It definitely seems more stable than something like Crash Bandicoot, because that's kind of the worst offender I've seen so far. You can see items popping in and out. I think I got some of that recorded, so I will try and put some of that footage in here. But it works. It looks good. I think it's all a matter of taste, to be honest, with some of this emulation stuff. Some people love the super high res, perspective correct textures, all of the kind of enhancements that things like Duckstation have been adding to the PlayStation experience. Some people want just a absolutely pure, this is what it looked like on my, you know, crappy 14-inch TV in 1996, 1997, whenever. And I think both are fair. The nice thing is you've got the option. And like I say, it runs perfectly. So it runs at 30 frames a second as it did on the original PlayStation. It looks, you know, presentable. Obviously, because it's emulating a PlayStation, all of the controls work as you expect. All the button prompts are as you expect. And it's got loading times, which the PC version didn't have. But again, you can speed up loading times. I haven't tried that, but I presume that would work here. So I think the PlayStation is a really viable way of playing this game, and probably for most people will be the version that they first came across this, unless they were lucky enough to have a PC at the time. I think I might have played all this. The PlayStation version might have been the third version that I played, actually, because I definitely saw the PC version early on. And then I saw our next pick to have a look at, which was the Sega Saturn version. Because I was one of those kids who had a Sega Saturn. I know. So, yeah, you can play the Sega Saturn version of Tomb Raider on your Steam Deck. And it runs surprisingly well. So, the thing I will say about Saturn emulation, it really isn't as mature as PlayStation emulation. It really only in the last few years has come across to the point where it feels like it's stable and kind of getting to a point where you can rely upon it. I would definitely say, Dreamcast emulation was making progress before Sega Saturn was, just because of the complexity of that architecture. So you don't have as rich a feature set for Sega Saturn. As far as I'm aware, for this core that's running in RetroArch, you don't have the option to boost the resolution. You don't have the option to, go in and mod the textures and things like that. So you're limited to what the game was capable of. The cutscenes all render properly. They are more pixely than the PlayStation version, probably because it's using a worse codec. I can't remember off the top of my head what the Sega Saturn codec was, because there was a couple. One of them was not great from memory, but it renders. It's got sound. The gameplay, as you can see, partly I thought it was quite interesting going from PC version to PlayStation version to Sega Saturn version. All of the menus are different, and even they render differently. Like the Sega Saturn version has different names of things underneath the icons. The PC version and the PlayStation version call it Lara's Home. The Sega Saturn version calls it Gym, which is really weird. I guess that probably highlights that we were definitely of an era where the code bases were different. Even the loading screens are different. So it is very bizarre. Cross-platform development was not as easy as it is now. I'm not suggesting that it's totally, you just take a PlayStation disc and put it in an Xbox. I'm not that stupid, but ultimately you're compiling the same code to different platforms for the most part these days. Whereas in these days you were kind of building bespoke versions of games. So as you can see, it's very pixely. But this is what the Sega Saturn version looked like. It was not as good looking as the PlayStation version, and it was one of those games that I know people were kind of hanging their hat on. Oh, the Sega Saturn version of Tomb Raider that's the one. I think IDOS very quickly realised, and Core Design very quickly realised that the PlayStation was going to be the home for Tomb Raider. By the time you got to Tomb Raider 2, Sega Saturn was basically gone. So yeah, I have some kind of, I guess, strange nostalgia for the Sega Saturn version of Tomb Raider, and I think that's the only reason you would ever play this version, especially with the emulation in the state that it's in. But it works. It's totally playable. I think the biggest downfall for me for playing the Sega Saturn version is obviously I say obviously, you might not know. The Sega Saturn controller is a 6-button controller. So whereas PlayStation's got 4 face buttons, 4 shoulder buttons, Sega Saturn's got 6 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons. And that does play havoc with the controls. The controls are a little bit more unusual. You'll probably see in some of this footage there's a lot of me pressing the wrong button because I just could not remember which button was which. And also because the Steam Deck is a 4-face button controller, it doesn't map up one-to-one. I get that you could sync a Bluetooth controller that's like a 6-button fight pad, but it sort of ruins the point of it being portable, to be honest, at that point. It doesn't. You're not going to drag your Steam Deck and a 6-button controller and a kickstand. Well, maybe you could, but it's not quite the spirit of what I'm looking at here. But it's a solid way to play it. I still think that if you're going to play a console version, you're going to want the PlayStation version. It just seems sensible to go for. I mean, it's the most kind of accomplished version of it on a console, and it's also the most stable from an emulation point of view. So add those two things together, kind of makes it a no-brainer. There is, however, multiple other options you can have a look at. So the first one that I wanted to look at was something called OpenLara. And now there's sort of 6 or 7 different kind of projects that are working to kind of modernize these games and make them available for players on modern platforms. OpenLara is just the one I picked because it's in RetroArch, so you can get access to it just with an install of RetroArch. You don't need anything else, and it even comes with the demo version of Tomb Raider for the PC, so you don't even need to own Tomb Raider to have a play with this. you can get it through the RetroArch kind of content downloader. So what you're looking at here is level 2, effectively. That is the demo for Tomb Raider. And as you can see, like, it's widescreen, it looks really nice, it's super smooth. It has its fair share of issues, which I guess we can get into now. As a recreation of the Tomb Raider engine, OpenLara, it does have its fair share of issues, and as an open source project, you can kind of go over and have a look at GitHub and read. I think it's a really impressive project thus far. It basically looks like you built something that will play Tomb Raider levels. As you can see here, we're just loading up the PlayStation map files, and it's kind of playing out directly from that. But there's a post from 2021 where, having spent a number of years working on it, he was then going back and trying to replicate it in such a way that it was accurate to the original game. And it sounds like they're basically just re-architecting the entire OpenLara kind of engine to be able to do that, especially to be able to support Tomb Raider 2 through Chronicles, which was Tomb Raider 5. So, yeah, the physics and the gunplay aren't necessarily accurate to the original PlayStation version, or the original PC version for that matter. It doesn't necessarily, so it can support frame rates above 60 FPS. Obviously on a Steam Deck, that's not much use to us, but if you're playing on a PC or another device that can support that, it can support that. The fact that this thing has been ported to so many different platforms, I mean, just looking down the list of issues, people are playing this on 3DS and Vita and PSP. That's kind of awesome to see Tomb Raider just appearing on a ton of different platforms. So I'm kind of hopeful that this project will kind of get there with its, V2, whatever the next version of it is going to be. And like I say, there are multiple different versions of this type of project out there. So it may well be that actually there are different kind of open source engine rewrites that would emulate Tomb Raider much more accurately or be a bit more playable. I didn't get a chance to have a look at any of those, but OpenLara is an interesting way of kind of seeing those games. I think it's kind of fascinating to see what a from the ground up kind of source port, I guess, is kind of the term for it, in the same way that Doom has gone from being a sprite based 3D shooter into all manner of things via source ports. OpenLara is an interesting thing. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it for playing through Tomb Raider 1, but it's an interesting curiosity. My next step was to start playing around with what we can do with the original PC version. If you look at ProtonDB or Steam Community, there are a number of different projects and different ways to improve the process of playing Tomb Raider on your PC. So there is a specific set of fixes called Tomb Raider Automated Fix. I believe it is available for Tomb Raider 2. I don't know whether it goes much beyond that, but the idea being that it's a kind of a collection of fixes that have been combined into one big executable that you just run as a setup. It improves all the FMVs, it improves all of the sound and various other bits and pieces. And it also, for the case of Tomb Raider 1, it restores the expansion pack, which was called Tomb Raider Unfinished Business, which is not available with the original Steam version. Now, the problem with that is it's an executable, and because the Steam Deck by default runs Linux, you can't run executables. So, what we had to do was first move Tomb Raider from using its Linux DOSBox version to forcing it to use Proton, which then means that you are running the Windows version of DOSBox, the Windows version of Tomb Raider 1, which is DOSBox underneath, through Proton. How many different layers can you get? But that means that we are running the Windows version. So now we can take that Windows version, go into the desktop mode, download the Tomb Raider automated fix, and then it's a case of trying to find a way to run that. So the way that I have been playing around with these sorts of things is to use bottles, which is this, I guess, sandboxed wine is maybe the best way to describe it. So wine is kind of I mean, it's been around for God knows how many decades, but it's effectively how to run Windows apps on Linux. It's like a compatibility layer. I don't know what the actual term for it is, but that's effectively what it's doing. So bottles will allow you to see all of the kind of wine containers that you've got on your machine. As it turns out, it's got support for Steam's Proton, which is the way that it kind of sandboxes each of the games into its own space. And it means that instead of running an executable on your Steam Deck, you are running kind of an executable within the container that Tomb Raider lives in. And so I will cuss around various bits of footage here. This is something, if I do more of these, we'll come back to, because there's some interesting things you can do. And I think probably people who are familiar with kind of modding Skyrim or that sort of thing, they probably have had to get used to this type of work. It's something that you can use wine tricks or proton tricks to do via the command line. I found it, to be honest, having done this a couple of times, not particularly very successfully. I have found bottles is the easiest way to get going, just because it gives you a bit of an interface to it. It also, I had to go in and comment something out in the code to actually get it to run on my Steam Deck, which I've got no idea why, but that was a bit of a pain in the arse. I did get the automated fix installed. It took me a while to figure out where the folder was, and yeah, took a long time to get there. As you can see, as I'm cutting through all of this stuff, eventually I got to the point where I could launch it from Steam, and it would launch this kind of, I guess launcher is the best way to describe it, where you can pick between Tomb Raider and Unfinished Business. As soon as you do that, you get a direct draw error, and that's the end of that. I tried another kind of option, and it completely broke the display. At that point, I kind of just gave up. I am sure you could get it working. I'm sure if I spent more time on it, I could get it working. I assume that would probably be the best way to play the PC version. It just takes a lot of tinkering and a lot of time. You'd think that would be the end of... I mean, we're not going to go look at the N-Gage version of Tomb Raider or the that GBA proof of concept that somebody created. Yes, you could play those probably on your Steam Deck, but why would you? There is one other way, though, to play Tomb Raider, and that is Tomb Raider Anniversary, which was a 2007 from the ground up remake by Crystal Dynamics, built on the Tomb Raider Legend engine. And it was originally for PS2, and I think it ended up getting ported to the Wii and to Xbox 360. But there's also a PC version. Now, the PC version is based on the PS2 version, and it is from that era of PC ports where you started to see a bit more support for Xbox 360 controllers. So it's probably in that Games for Windows Live, Games for Windows kind of era. But the PC ports, not particularly perfect. So what I will say, and I'll kind of cut around some of the footage here, the video cutscenes don't look great. The options, there's not a great deal of them, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But the gamepad support it will recognise a controller, so it saw my PS4 controller as an Xbox 360 controller. I guess Steam is doing the compatibility layer there. And it runs at 1280 by 800, the same resolution as the screen. And when you get into it, it looks pretty promising. It runs at 60 frames per second. It uses barely any of the resources of the machine. I will turn on the Steam performance overlay so you can kind of get a feel for that, but it's barely using any of the power of the machine. which is good because it means it will be really great for battery life. And the controls work out of the box, so that is positive. I will say though, there are a few downsides. The main one for me is the fact that it doesn't, even though it supports the Xbox 360 controller, all of the prompts in the game relates to the keyboard, no matter whether you've got a controller plugged in or not. So you can have the controller plugged in, all the buttons work perfectly fine, but it will tell you to use the F key, or it will tell you to press the control key. So you're going to have to figure out what the buttons are yourself, which is not great, to be honest. If it's a game where you've played it before and you know the controls, that probably won't be an issue, but it's a bit of an oversight, and probably before the era when we were used to games kind of auto switching to controls or keyboard controls. That's one thing. The other thing is that it's not particularly configurable, so you can't, well, not that I could see, I couldn't find a way to turn VSync off in the game, and the reason that I wanted to turn it off is that there's a bit of judder, and the Steam overlay is reporting that it's running at 60 frames per second, so it sort of suggests that it's some sort of frame pacing issue. And so I wanted to turn off VSync, and then potentially you could limit the frame rate via the Steam controls, but it wouldn't let me. As it turns out, the PC version of Tomb Raider Anniversary stores its configuration in the Windows registry. Quite why they chose to put it there, I have got no idea. It seems madness to me. But you can go through, and I'll show, like, you can go through and edit the registry on these Steam games. Like, it's got a registry file. You can actually, again, go through bottles and you can get access to a registry editor, which will use the files that it's kind of got as part of the Proton profile for the game. And so you can go and change the config and turn the VSync off. And I was hoping that would fix it. Didn't really seem to fix it. Still seemed quite juddery. So it's not a perfect version. It's a shame, because actually having played it, it's one of those games I've been meaning to play for absolutely ages. I have owned it in multiple different ways. And, you know, the Steam Deck has got enough horsepower that I bet it could run this super sampled. It could run this at 1080p, no problem. But there's just enough janky bits to make it difficult to recommend. It's $6.99 on Steam. Routinely, it's kind of £1, I think, in the sales when they sell off the Tomb Raider franchise. So it's not like it's really expensive, but it's a flawed port, which is a shame, because it does seem like a great game, which kind of leads to my last ditch attempt, which was there's a couple of other options I probably could have gone for. There's a PS2 version. PS2 emulation is really quite powerful on Steam Deck. You could probably run the PlayStation 2 version, and I imagine that would give you access to things like upsampling and, you know, running at higher resolutions, that sort of stuff. Didn't get a chance to try that, but I imagine that would probably be a way to go. There's a Wii version. I would imagine that would run pretty well, but I don't know what the motion control situation is with that game, whether they tried to put a whole bunch of waggle controls in. Probably, unless it's got classic controller support, probably would steer clear of that version. There was also an Xbox 360 version, and Xbox 360 emulation, not something that you're going to want to engage in on the Steam Deck on a regular basis. So the nuclear option was to use Remote Play to my Xbox Series X and installing the Xbox 360 version. Now, this is cheating. This is not actually running the game on the Steam Deck. I am aware of this. But I just wanted to see what the experience was like, and it's not great. So it seems like a game that doesn't have FPS boost, so it is locked at the performance that the game had on 360, which seems to be 30 frames a second. Doesn't appear to be using any sort of like resolution boosting either, which is probably not a surprise. So you're stuck at whatever 720p resolution it was. That combined with streaming it over Xbox Remote Play Anywhere leaves it looking pretty grimy. So it's a shame as well, because the 360 version, they did a bunch to the graphics. Like you can see in the cutscenes, they are far higher resolution than the PC version. And also you can see that, hey, you can see which buttons you need to press. That's quite nice. So I guess, you know, this is an option. Who's going to choose this to play Tomb Raider? I don't know. I think what will probably happen is I will play Tomb Raider Anniversary on my Xbox in the front room and probably not play it remote play through the Steam Deck. But it's, you know, I thought I would throw that in as an extra bonus, just because as I was putting this together, I realised that that was an option. And it's, to be honest, kind of leads into what I would recommend in terms of playing Tomb Raider 1. I think the original PC version is probably a solid pick. I think you're going to have to do some work, though. It works out of the box. I can't say for how long it would. And you know, I don't know that you'll get to the end of the game without a crash or anything like that. But it's there. That is an option. I think the PlayStation version is probably the version that I would pick. I think PlayStation emulation is so stable and so mature at this point that you get a lot of stuff out of the box that you just don't get from the PC version. And I think my runner-up pick would be Tomb Raider Anniversary. It's got its flaws, and the PC version is not as great as it could be. But I think it's still, even from the 10-15 minutes that I played of it, it was kind of hooking me in. I think that's probably says something for the quality of the game. It is a different game. It's not a like lovingly faithful recreation of the original game. It's very much Tomb Raider Legends style game wrapped around the framework of the original. So you have to put that into some sort of context. I think that's why it's my runner-up, because ultimately it's not Tomb Raider 1. It is something a little bit different. But I think it's still worth visiting. It's not a remake that kind of just decimates the original. It is just kind of a different take on it, and one that has probably aged fairly well. That is Tomb Raider 1. I had originally intended to kind of look at a bunch of Tomb Raider games, but as you can tell, this ballooned massively out of control and has taken many hours to put together. So I'd like to keep doing these. They are time consuming, and I'm having to change the format every time I do them, which again takes time, but it's kind of fun. It is the most fun that I have with the Steam Deck, other than playing, you know, Tetris or Lumines or something. It's just trying to get this old weird software working. So yeah, if it is of interest, let me know. Recommend stuff. That'd be fun to have a play with. I've got a couple of ideas and things that I want to have a play with, but for now, yeah, keep raiding tombs. Is that how I'm going to end this? Apparently that's the way I'm going to end this. Abysmal.